Great. Thank you very much, Bistra. And thank you, Carla and David, for inviting me to join you. I apologize I've not been able to spend more time here. As some of you know, today is the 7th day of existence of Cornell's newest college. I've been a little preoccupied getting that set up, but I have had a chance to browse posters and catch a couple of sessions, and I'm very excited by what I see going on here. And I'm half tempted to ask to give my 10 minutes back and just hear more of Steve and watch more cool pictures. I don't have anything like that to offer you, unfortunately. But what I do have to offer is a rather large-scale perspective of what a group of economists here at Cornell and a broader community outside of Cornell that work on problems of what I'll call poverty traps, sometimes more broadly referred to as persistent poverty or ultra poverty in rural areas of Africa in particular, how we are increasingly seeing the opportunities of computational sustainability as a really valuable tool in combating ultra poverty, and how data collection and data analysis techniques made available through computational advances in particular are really useful at helping the challenges faced by populations like the one you see here in northern Kenya. So just to set the stage, this slide just is a quick depiction of basic data on poverty. The World Bank has an extreme poverty line, which it actually is updated to $1.90 per person per day in 2015 terms. I did not switch these data yet, so these are still in 2011 terms at its prior $1.25 a day extreme poverty line. So this is half of the extreme poverty line, what some of us refer to as ultra poverty. And what it shows over time from 1981, the first data points, to 2011, size of bubble is simply the size of the population as a head count, and the vertical scaling is the prevalence in the population. There are a couple of things you should take away from this. The first is the world has achieved astonishingly fast reduction in ultra poverty. Over the course of 30 years, we've gone from something on the order of 700 million people living on inflation-adjusted 60 cents a day to less than 200 million. And in East Asia, it's almost disappeared entirely. And the bulk of that population was in East Asia in the early 80s. The second thing you should take away from this is that the problem is now overwhelmingly an African one. Where in 1981, 1 out of 8 people in the world who lived at this really abject standard of living, only 1 out of 8 lived in sub-Saharan Africa 30 years ago. Today, something on the order of 85% is living in sub-Saharan Africa. So ultra poverty is increasingly spatially concentrated. And I don't depict it here, but it's concentrated in particular in rural areas, and disproportionately rural areas with poor soils, unreliable rainfall, limited access to irrigation, and places that are subject to violence, civil war, guerrilla war, unrest, etc. And this complex begets reinforcing feedback. A number of us were just at a major conference in Washington last week. The National Bureau for Economic Research hosted a conference on poverty traps. This is an area of very active research within economics as we struggle to uncover the simultaneity involved in poverty, hunger, natural resource degradation, violence. Each causes the other in very complicated, contextualized ways. And this puts a real demand on analysts, because you don't quite know where to start, and you don't know which factors are dominant in a given setting. So why this group of children from a war-affected, drought-plagued part of the Horn of Africa are suffering malnutrition and therefore going to have all kinds of long-term productivity problems. The suite of different factors that contribute to the etiology of their long-run ultra-poverty is sometimes daunting to those working on problems of poverty reduction. So what can computational sustainability do? What can computational methods do? Well, the big thing is we need to be able to figure out what are the particular limiting problems in a given setting. So what I refer to there as a function of diagnostics. So what are the factors for a given population at a given moment in time are first limiting? That if we can relax this one constraint, we can make some progress. Surely there's a different constraint coming right along behind it. We need to be prepared to address that too. The context of that opening picture of camel herders in the Chalbi Desert of northern Kenya, the primary constraint they face is the occurrence of extreme droughts. that wipe out 40 to 50% of herds any given drought event. And the ability to recover from that was really the primary thing driving behaviors and their capacity to diversify livelihoods and accumulate wealth. So identifying the kind of first limiting factor is the first thing we have to do. Second is, having identified what the real immediate problem is, who then do you try to assist, when, where, and how do you assist them best, given budgets are really scarce? You would love to be able to afford a whole lot of different interventions at once and try it on a broad swath of people, especially in places where the vast majority of people are relatively poor. Some are just more poor than others. But the reality is we can't afford that. So we have to target fairly carefully. And computational methods can be very helpful in targeting. Finally, when you design interventions, you think you know what's first limiting. You think you can target the people to whom you want to deliver a particular new product, a form of assistance, what have you. You then need to evaluate and figure out, well, first you need to design the intervention, and second you need to evaluate it. And these are all three areas where advances in computational methods can be really helpful. My group has had the good fortune of working with Carla's group, and we've been learning a ton about new, better ways we can try to help with each of these three functions: diagnostics, targeting, and design and evaluation of interventions. So let me just give you a couple of examples. I think you've already heard a lightning talk by Eddie and or Nathan. I can't remember the sequencing of who's gone when. There's a poster outside on some really creative work that they've been doing on mobile phone-based crowdsourcing of rangeland information. So we developed an index insurance product, a livestock insurance product designed to guard against catastrophic loss of herd due to drought events, based off of remotely sent satellite data that we process in near real time. It's privately insured and distributed. We've evaluated it rigorously. It works. But there is a big problem with it. From a satellite, everything green looks the same. Some of it is palatable, some of it's toxic. And you don't know which is which just based off of spectral measures coming off satellites. So you really need somebody to ground truth it. But these are very remote areas. Who is best placed to ground truth? Well, herders themselves. Using phones, Rich and others figured out some clever ways to program to develop a simple set of screens that even a largely illiterate population can use to identify where they are, identify the sparseness or density of the vegetative cover, what's the state of the cover, is it browning, is it green, what kind of animals are grazing here. There are other screens too, but these combination of screens just with simple touches enable us to collect data that essentially ground truths what's happening in near real time. And they've run some really clever experiments with trying to get people to disperse spatially so that we can fill in the blanks, if you will. Because you know about the places people are presently grazing, you want to know more about the places they perhaps aren't grazing. There's related work on identifying soil limitations. Africa right now is losing something on the order of $15 billion a year in valuable soil nutrients as net flux of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. And we struggle to know where to intervene. We struggle to know which places are growing dangerously limited in particular nutrients and soils. There are some really nice advances in near-infrared reflectance spectroscopy, NIRS, both handheld and machine-mounted. And combining those with historical databases, you can generate mapping devices and real-time plot management tools. I'll show you an image of one in another in a moment. Early warning systems have been increasingly using remotely sensed data to do computational work that in near real time can provide very helpful advice for emergency responders on where we're likely to be seeing crop failures. I think Stefano is presenting some work on this, some work in Sentinel sites. Ushahidi, which is a really nice crowdsourcing site developed to respond to violence in Kenya. Isoko, and there are other products like that. I noticed there's one on Uganda being discussed in a poster outside that's providing near real-time market information. These things are all great at aggregating data, from especially crowdsourcing data to address deficiencies in systems that impede our ability to diagnose where we need to be intervening. Then targeting One of the things that my group did a few years ago was develop something called targeting maps techniques, where we can use existing census and survey data to be able to prioritize where would be the optimal location for, say, Heifer International. There's one thing you do, you hand out livestock. Well, where's the highest marginal return to poor people in your country from that particular intervention? Or flip it around, you're working with a particular parish, a particular county in a given country, and you've got a suite of different interventions. What's the highest return intervention for poverty reduction in that location? So computational methods let us get at these sorts of much more refined tools to inform ultra-poverty reduction efforts. On the left is an example of a fertilizer value cost ratio tool developed by my Cornell colleague Josh Woodard. You can go to aganalytics.org and put in different data on what kind of seed are you using, what value cost ratio do you need, what probability of exceeding that value cost ratio is necessary for you to feel confident in investing in fertilizer. Then it will pop up a map like this showing you where the highest returns, lowest returns are. The Ethiopian government is using this to help cite fertilizer blending facilities and extension messaging. We're seeing yesterday that Congress passed a new Food Security Act that enables us to have greater flexibility in food response to emergencies. That lets us use some things called Mafira tools. Okay, one last one. So interventions, this is a real-time commodity price board in Ethiopia in a dusty village called Yabelo, where Nathan used to live. This is an example of the receipt that comes from handheld point-of-sale devices in remote areas selling index-based livestock insurance to herders. We can develop these sorts of new tools, new interventions using better computational-based methods, and we can evaluate them much more effectively. In the Dyson School, the postdocs and grad students have a nice blog called Economics That Really Matters. It comes from this opening sentence of Ted Schultz's Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Most people in the world are poor, so if we knew the economics of being poor, we would know much of the economics that really matters. Computational methods can really help us in tackling the economics that really matters, especially in places like rural Africa where data are sparse, it's expensive to collect them, we typically don't have great processing capacity locally. We can help with this through the sorts of methods all of you are developing. So thank you.
Maybe one question. Go ahead.
Well, I was intrigued by the use of the self-reporting for the insurance product that you guys are working with, and just and maybe there's someone else in your group to ask about this, but how do you deal with moral hazard problems when you have such decentralized insurance systems? And I can see the information coming in and be really valuable for informing payout triggers and whatnot, but I deal with actual moral hazard problems.
Yeah, so this is an index insurance product. The concept of moral hazard, for those unfamiliar with it, is the idea that if I have an incentive to misreport, and I have an incentive to not do due diligence, manage my herd as effectively as I might if somebody else bears the risk. Index insurance, one of the virtues of it is that we insure based on an area experience, a population's experience rather than the individual loss. So it obviates that moral hazard problem as long as you're covering enough people that my own behavior doesn't matter to the overall risk pool. So the reporting that we're working on, and we don't yet have the crowdsourcing data integrated into the IBLI design and the IBLI pricing. Right now it's still entirely driven by remotely sensed data. We're trying to refine that because of the imprecision, the basis risk we find in that product right now. But it should be exactly the same thing going on, because the crowdsourced data, like remotely sensed data, is just telling us something about the broader conditions in the area, which we use to predict local average losses. And so I still have the same incentive to manage my herd well. It shouldn't stimulate any moral hazard problem. And we don't observe any, moreover, in evaluation, perhaps more importantly.
In the interest of time, I'm just going to take a speaker one more time.